October 1987. An oak forest in Oregon. A 43-year-old woman kneels between two rows of logs covered in mushrooms. She pulls a single shiitake from the bark and lifts it up to the morning light. Her name is Theodora Holcomb. Her son, Silas, is 19 years old that fall. He is alive. And that mushroom in her hands, along with the 48 pounds she will harvest over the next 2 days, will be delivered on Friday morning to a chef named Tomás Vargas at a restaurant in Portland called Veranda. The check Tomás will write her at the end of that delivery will be for $14,000. The largest single transaction in the 11-year history of the Holcomb operation. But this story does not begin in 1987. This story begins 11 years earlier, in March of 1976, on the linoleum floor of the Lane County Memorial Hospital pediatric ward in Eugene, where Theodora Holcomb sat in a green vinyl chair next to a hospital bed and listened to a doctor named Reginald Yardley explain, in a voice that he had practiced too many times to make it gentle anymore, that her 8-year-old son had acute lymphoblastic leukemia and that the treatment protocol would last between 2 and 3 years, and that the cost of the treatment would be approximately $34,000, and that her insurance, which her late husband's small logging operation had been paying premiums on for 9 years, would cover roughly $11,000 of that, and that the difference, which was $23,000, would need to be paid in installments to the hospital and to the pharmacy and to the diagnostic services across the state line in Roseburg, beginning within the next 60 days. Theodora was 32. Her husband, Charles, had died in a chainsaw accident 22 months earlier in a stand of Douglas fir on a logging contract on the Mackenzie River. The life insurance policy from his small operating company had paid out $14,000 in the spring of 1974, of which she had used $9,000 to pay off the truck and the operating loans and the funeral, leaving $5,000 in a savings account that was meant to be Silas's college fund. The Holcomb home place was 22 acres, with a small 2-bedroom cabin and a workshop and a chicken coop and a strip of cleared meadow along a creek. And beyond that, 22 cleared acres, there were 180 acres of dense second-growth oak and Douglas fir forest, sloping up toward a ridge that her father-in-law Wendell Holcomb had purchased in 1952 for $14 an acre, and that everyone in Lane County had always assumed would be sold to a timber company someday for somebody to clear. Theodora had no income in March of 1976. Charles had been her income. She had a chicken flock of 46 birds and a vegetable garden and the savings account. She had a high school diploma and 1 year of community college coursework in office administration that she had abandoned when she had married Charles in 1965. She had no living parents. She had one sister in Portland, who was struggling herself with 3 children, and a husband who had just been laid off from a paper mill. She listened to Dr. Yardley, and she did not cry. Crying was something she had finished doing in the spring of 1974, standing in the rain on a logging road outside of Blue River. She nodded. She stood up. She thanked the doctor. She walked out to the parking lot, and she sat in her 1969 Ford F-100 pickup for 37 minutes without starting the engine, calculating in her head how she was going to come up with $23,000 in 24 months while caring for a sick child on 22 acres of hill country in southwestern Oregon. She did not know then that the answer would come from the 180 acres of forest she had not yet thought to consider, and from a paperback book she would buy 6 weeks later from a used bookstore on Pearl Street in Eugene for 60 cents, and from a slow accumulation of laughter in the parking lot of the Cross Hill Feed and Grain in the small town of Lowell that would last for almost 6 years before it began to die down. The book was titled The Cultivation of Shiitake on Logs, by a Japanese mycologist named Hiroshi Kanematsu, translated into English in 1968 by a graduate student at the University of California, Davis, and printed in a soft-cover edition of approximately 3,000 copies that had not sold well in the United States, because in 1968 there was almost no market for shiitake mushrooms outside of the Japanese-American grocery shops in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Theodora had not gone to the bookstore looking for a mushroom book. She had gone looking for a book on small-scale beekeeping, because she had read in a Mother Earth news article that a woman in Vermont had paid off her medical bills with a sideline honey operation, and she had thought she might do the same. The beekeeping book she wanted was not on the shelf. She browsed the agricultural section. The Kanematsu book was the second-to-last book on the bottom shelf. The cover was a photograph of a Japanese forest with rows of inoculated logs leaning in pyramid stacks against horizontal poles. The title caught her eye because she had eaten shiitake exactly once in her life, at a Japanese restaurant in Portland in 1971 with Charles, and she had remembered the texture and the way the dried form had reconstituted into something dense and almost meaty in the broth. She read the first 2 pages of the book, standing in the aisle. She bought it. She read it 3 times in the next 4 days, sitting at the kitchen table at the cabin while Silas slept off the first round of chemotherapy on a fold-out cot in the next room. The book explained that shiitake required hardwood logs of specific species, that white oak and red oak were ideal, but that other oak varieties were workable, that the logs needed to be cut between November and February when the tree was dormant and the bark was tight, that they needed to be 36 to 48 inches long and 4 to 6 inches in diameter, that they needed to be inoculated with shiitake spawn within 60 days of cutting before competing fungi colonized the wood, that the inoculation involved drilling holes in a precise diamond pattern and pressing wooden plugs colonized with shiitake mycelium into the holes and sealing the holes with food-grade wax, that the inoculated logs needed to be stacked in shaded, humid conditions for a colonization period of 12 to 18 months, and that the first crop of mushrooms could be expected to appear in the autumn of the second year after inoculation, with peak production reaching in years 3 through 5. The economics, in the section Theodora read 4 times, indicated that 1 acre of forest with 2,000 inoculated logs could produce, by year 5, approximately 1,800 pounds of fresh shiitake per year, which at the wholesale price quoted in the Tokyo and Kyoto markets in 1968 of approximately $4 per pound, would represent a gross income of around $7,200 per year per acre. The 1968 American market price, the translator noted in a footnote, was effectively zero because no commercial market existed. There was no market for shiitake in Oregon in March of 1976. Theodora knew this. There was no shiitake market anywhere in the United States, outside of a few specialty grocers in California. But she had 180 acres of oak forest. She had 2 cords of seasoned oak in the woodshed already cut. She had a hospital bill that was about to start arriving. She had a quiet conviction, from somewhere she could not name, that the absence of a market in 1976 did not mean an absence in 1980 or 1985. And that whatever she planted now in the form of inoculated logs would mature into a productive system at the same time as a market might begin to develop. She placed her order in early May of 1976 with a small mycology supply company in Olympia, Washington called Northwest Mushroom Spawn, run by a former University of Washington researcher named Doris Lefferts. The order was for 4,000 wooden plugs colonized with shiitake mycelium, plus a 5-pound bag of inoculation wax, plus 4 10mm step-bit drill bits, plus a handheld inoculation tool. The total cost, with shipping, was $317. She also bought a chainsaw bar replacement and a small shed-built wax heater and a roll of waterproof labels, bringing the total initial investment in her shiitake operation to approximately $400. She felled 12 oak trees on the lower slope of the back 180 in late May of 1976, working alone with the chainsaw Charles had taught her to use in 1968. She bucked them into 40-inch lengths, producing approximately 200 logs in the right diameter range. She did the inoculation in the shed behind the cabin in the second week of June 1976. The drill pattern was a diamond grid with 2-inch spacing between holes, and the work took her 3 full days. She sealed the plugs with melted wax. She labeled each log with a date and a batch number on a waterproof tag stapled to the cut end. She moved the logs in the truck, 2 at a time, to a north-facing slope at the south edge of the back 180, where there was natural shade from a canopy of Douglas firs and where a small intermittent stream provided ambient humidity. She stacked the logs in pyramid configurations against horizontal poles, exactly as the Kanematsu book described. The work, from felling to final stacking, took her 17 days. By the end of June 1976, she had 200 inoculated oak logs sitting in the forest behind her cabin, and she had paid the first $800 of Silas's hospital bills out of her remaining savings, and she had no idea whether anything would ever grow on those logs. She told one person about the project in the first year. She told Wendell, her father-in-law, who was 71 and who lived alone in a smaller cabin half a mile up the road. Wendell had inherited his own father's healthy skepticism about people who tried clever things on the land. He listened to Theodora explain the project on a Saturday afternoon in July of 1976, sitting on the porch of his cabin with a cup of coffee, and when she was done he was quiet for a long time. "Teddy, yes, Wendell. You inoculated 200 oak logs with Japanese mushrooms. Yes. You're going to wait 2 years to see if they grow? Yes. And if they grow, you're going to sell mushrooms that nobody in this part of Oregon eats? Yes. And the money is supposed to pay Silas's bills? Yes." He looked at his coffee for a while. He had liked Theodora since the day Charles brought her home in 1964, and he had never stopped liking her, and he understood that whatever he said next would matter. "Teddy," he finally said, "I think you have lost your mind. But I am going to help you anyway, because Silas is my grandson, and you are my son's wife, and we are running out of better ideas." He came down to her place on Sunday morning. He helped her fell the second batch of trees. He helped her with the inoculation. He told nobody else for 9 months. The laugh started in February of 1977. Theodora drove into Lowell that morning to buy chicken feed at the Crosshill Feed and Grain. The store was run by a man named Kenneth Doolittle, who had owned it for 23 years and who knew everyone in the eastern half of Lane County. Kenneth's wife, Patrice, worked behind the counter. There were 3 other customers in the store that morning, 2 men in flannel shirts buying tractor parts, and 1 woman in a wool coat picking up bags of garden soil. Patrice asked Theodora the question that small-town counterworkers ask, which was how Silas was doing, and Theodora gave the answer she had refined over the previous 10 months, which was that he was holding his own and that the doctors were optimistic about the next round of treatment. Patrice asked if there was anything the community could do. Theodora hesitated. She had a Mother Earth News in her purse with a marked page in it about the importance of letting the community help, and she had been trying to follow the advice in the article. She told Patrice that she was developing a small farm operation on the back acreage to help with the bills, and that if anyone in the area knew anyone who might be interested in buying specialty mushrooms in 1978 or 1979, she would appreciate the introduction. Patrice looked at her for a moment. The 2 men buying tractor parts had paused. The woman with the garden soil had paused. Mushrooms. Yes. What kind of mushrooms? Shiitake. Patrice did not know how to pronounce the word. Theodora pronounced it for her. She explained, in 2 sentences, that they were a Japanese forest mushroom and that there was a small market for them developing in the cities. The first laugh came from one of the men in flannel shirts. It was not a malicious laugh. It was a startled laugh, the kind a person gives when they have just heard something that does not match any of the categories they were expecting to hear about in the feed and grain on a Tuesday morning. The other man laughed because the first man laughed. Patrice put her hand to her mouth, which was the gesture small-town women use when they are trying not to laugh in front of someone who does not deserve to be laughed at. Kenneth Doolittle came out of the back room because he heard the laughter, and he asked what was funny, and the first man told him, and Kenneth's reaction was the worst, because Kenneth did not laugh. Kenneth gave Theodora the look that men give widows when they have decided privately that the widow is making a sentimental and impractical decision that the community is going to have to clean up after. And that look traveled across Lowell faster than any laugh would have. By the end of that week, the women at the post office had heard. By the end of February, the men at the saw filing shop had heard. By March, the deacons at the Lowell Community Church had heard, and one of them, a retired logger named Eldridge Marsh, had stopped Theodora in the church parking lot and told her, in a voice he believed was kind, that perhaps she should consider selling the back 180 to Weyerhaeuser, which was paying $80 an acre for second-growth Douglas fir in 1977, and using the proceeds to pay down the hospital bills and rebuild her finances on the cleared land. The 180 acres at $80 per acre would have been $14,400. It would have paid off Silas's medical bills with money to spare. Theodora thanked Eldridge for his concern and said she was going to wait. She did not explain why. She did not tell Eldridge or anyone else in Lowell that she was waiting because 200 oak logs were sitting on a north slope, colonizing slowly with Japanese mycelium, and that if those logs began to fruit in the autumn of 1978, as the Kanematsu book predicted, the back 180 would become more valuable as a forest than as a clear-cut. She did not tell anyone because she did not yet believe it herself, with enough certainty to defend it in public. She paid the February 1977 hospital bill with the last of the truck egg sales and a small loan against the cabin from a credit union in Eugene that her late husband's father co-signed reluctantly. She kept inoculating logs through the spring of 1977, working alone except for Wendell on Sundays, building the operation up to 400 logs by June and 600 by September. The autumn of 1977 came and went without any mushrooms appearing on the original 200-log batch, which was correct according to the book, because shiitake on logs do not fruit in the first year. The autumn of 1978 came. Theodora walked the rows on the morning of October 12, 1978, the way she had walked them every morning that fall, with a small flashlight and a notebook, and on the 17th log of the third row, she found the first pin, a small bronze and cream cap, pushing through the bark at the height of her knee, no larger than a thumbnail. She knelt in the wet duff and looked at it for a long time. She did not pick it. She did not photograph it. She did not have a camera. She walked back to the cabin, and she made a cup of tea, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she allowed herself to cry for the first time since the rain on the logging road in 1974. By October 30th, 1978, the original 200 logs had produced 14 pounds of fresh shiitake mushrooms. The next question, the question the Kanematsu book did not answer, because the book had been written for a Japanese market that already existed, was who in Oregon would buy them. Theodora drove to Portland on November 2nd, 1978, with 11 pounds of fresh shiitake packed in cardboard berry baskets covered with paper towels, in a wood crate, in the bed of the F-100. She had 3 pounds left at home in the refrigerator for Silas, who at age 10 was in remission and who had decided, after some initial caution, that he liked them sautéed in butter on toast. She drove to the public market in Portland. She walked through it for 2 hours. She tried 6 produce buyers. 5 of them did not know what shiitake mushrooms were. The 6th, a thin man in a long apron at a stall called Higgins Fresh, knew what they were and offered her $1.20 a pound. The wholesale price for cultivated shiitake in Tokyo in 1978 was approximately $7 a pound. She took the $1.20 because she did not have a counteroffer. She drove home with $13.20 in her pocket, against an investment that had grown to almost $1,400 over 2.5 years, and against $4,200 in current hospital bills that needed to be paid by the end of the month. She did not despair. She did the math on the kitchen table that night. At £1,800 per acre per year of mature production, even at $1.20 a pound, the operation would gross $20,160 per acre per year. With 4 acres of logs coming online over the next 3 years, The operation would produce roughly $8,600 per year by 1982, which would, combined with the chickens and the eggs and the small income she had begun to make selling vegetables at the Eugene Farmers Market, allow her to keep the property and pay down the hospital debt at a sustainable pace. She wrote the numbers down. She underlined the relevant ones. She went to bed. She inoculated 800 more logs in the spring of 1979. Silas finished his treatment in June of 1979. He was declared in clinical remission on June 17, 1979, by Dr. Yardley, who had aged 5 years in 3. The hospital still owed Theodora a final accounting. The total bills after insurance came to $26,400. She had paid $11,800 of them in the previous 3 years through the truck eggs and the credit union loan and the savings draw and a small inheritance from a great-aunt in Klamath Falls. She owed $14,600. She had a forest of 1,200 inoculated oak logs, of which 200 were producing, 400 were within months of producing, and 600 were still in the colonization phase. The years 1979 through 1983 were the slow years. She continued to inoculate logs. She continued to harvest mushrooms in modest weekly batches in the autumn months. She continued to sell to Higgins Fresh in Portland and, beginning in 1980, to a second buyer named Hughes Market in Portland's Old Town, which was run by a Chinese-American family who paid her $1.80 a pound because they understood the difference between a log-grown shiitake and the Chinese imports they were getting from a wholesaler in San Francisco. She paid down the hospital debt at roughly $3,000 per year through 1983. Silas grew tall and thin and began to help her in the forest on weekends. The laughter at the Cross Hill Feed and Grain did not stop, exactly, but it began to take on a different quality. The first man who had laughed in February of 1977, a logger named Bert Castellano, came to the cabin in the spring of 1981 and asked, with his hat in his hand, whether Theodora would consider selling him 5 pounds of mushrooms because his daughter, who lived in San Francisco, had told him about a Japanese restaurant where they sold for $9 a pound, and his wife had asked him to bring some home for Easter. Theodora gave him 5 pounds. She charged him $1 a pound, which was less than she charged her wholesalers, because Bert had been the first one to laugh, and there was something in his face when he asked that suggested he had learned a thing he was not yet ready to say out loud. Bert told the men at the saw filing shop. The story went around Lowell. The laughter quieted. People began, in 1981 and 1982, to drive past the Holcomb cabin on Sundays, just to look at the long rows of inoculated logs visible through the trees from the county road, and to nod their heads in the way that rural Oregonians nod when they have realized they were wrong about something but are not yet ready to apologize. Eldridge Marsh, the deacon who had recommended she sell to Weyerhaeuser in 1977, did not stop her in the church parking lot anymore. He drove past her in his truck once in the autumn of 1982, and he looked at her through his windshield with an expression that was not quite an apology, but that was no longer judgment, and he tipped his cap, and he kept driving. Theodora did not need apologies in 1982. She needed the next phase, which was the phase she had been planning for since she had read the Kanematsu book in 1976, which was the development of a market. The next phase began on a Wednesday afternoon in March of 1983 when a young man named Tomás Vargas walked into Hughes Market in Portland's Old Town with a wholesale supplier list in his hand and asked the Yu family who supplied the shiitake. Tomás was 27 years old. He had grown up in Sonora, Mexico, and had moved to Portland at 19 to work as a line cook at a hotel restaurant downtown. He had spent the next 8 years in increasingly serious kitchens. He had spent a year in San Francisco at a restaurant where the chef was experimenting with a new approach that brought together Japanese, French, and Pacific Northwest produce. He had returned to Portland in 1982 with a partner who had inherited some money, and they had opened a small restaurant on a side street near the Pearl District called Veranda, which had 32 seats and a menu that changed every 2 weeks, and which was beginning, in the spring of 1983, to be talked about by the small group of food writers in Portland who paid attention to such things. Tomás was building a supplier network. He had decided he wanted to source shiitake mushrooms from a regional grower if any existed. The youths told him about Theodora. They wrote her phone number on a paper napkin. Tomás drove out to Lane County on the following Saturday. He arrived at the Holcomb cabin at 10 in the morning. He spent the next 4 hours walking the forest with Theodora, looking at the logs, asking questions in careful English about colonization rates and harvest cycles and varietal characteristics. He understood mycology. He had read 3 books on it. He was not Hiroshi Kanematsu, but he was the first person to walk that forest with Theodora since 1976 who could name what he was looking at. They sat on the cabin porch at 2 in the afternoon and drank coffee. Tomás asked her what she charged her current wholesalers. She told him. He asked her what production she was at. She told him. She had 2,800 logs in active production by then, with another 800 in colonization, and she was producing, depending on the season, between 60 and 140 pounds of fresh shiitake per week from late September through early December. Tomás did the math. He told her that he wanted to buy her entire production for the autumn of 1983 at $4 a pound, which was 3 times what Higgins was paying and twice what Hughes was paying, on a contract that gave him first refusal on the autumn harvest each year for the next 3 years. He said it slowly. He said it because he had decided in the woods that morning that the shiitake she was producing on those oak logs were the best mushrooms he had ever seen in the United States, and that he was not going to lose access to them by negotiating the way restaurant supply contracts were normally negotiated. Theodora was 39 years old. She had not negotiated a major contract in her life. She had been alone in the forest for 7 years. She listened to Tomás. She nodded. She told him she would call him on Monday. She walked the forest alone after he left. She walked it for 2 hours. She thought about the years she had spent in that forest with no one watching except Wendell on Sundays. She thought about the laugh in the Crosshill feed and grain. She thought about the look Dr. Yardley had given her when she had explained, in the autumn of 1979, that she was paying the hospital bills with mushroom money. She thought about Silas, who was 15 in 1983 and who had been in remission for 4 years. She called Tomás on Monday morning. She accepted the contract. The autumn of 1983 produced 4,200 pounds of shiitake from her forest. At $4 a pound, the gross income was $16,800, of which she paid Tomás's commission of nothing because the contract was direct and against operating costs of approximately $1,800, leaving a net of $15,000. It was the largest annual income she had earned in her life. She paid off the last of Silas's hospital bills in November of 1983 with money to spare for the first time. She did not buy a new truck. She kept the F-100. She did not move out of the cabin. She did, however, hire a part-time helper for the autumn harvest, a 22-year-old woman named Elena Mendez, who had been working as a waitress in Eugene, and who had stopped by the farmer's market the previous spring and had asked, in the way that quiet people ask things, whether Theodora needed help. Elena worked the harvest in 1983, 1984, and 1985, and by the autumn of 1986, she was the operations manager of an enterprise that had grown to 4,000 logs across 2 clearings on the back 180, with annual production that had exceeded 7,000 pounds and gross income that had passed $30,000. Tomás Vargas, in the spring of 1986, took Theodora to dinner in Portland to ask whether she would consider selling exclusively to Veranda for the autumn of 1987 in exchange for a fixed pricing agreement of $5 a pound across the season. He had reasons. Veranda had received its first major review in the Oregonian in November of 1985. The chef who had reviewed it, a woman named Dorothy Fairchild, had named Veranda one of the 3 most important restaurants in Portland in her annual roundup. Tomás had been featured in a profile in Sunset magazine in February of 1986. He had begun to be invited to cook at events in San Francisco and Seattle. The Veranda menu had become, by early 1986, a menu that food writers in 3 states paid attention to. Tomás needed a guaranteed supply of the shiitake that had become his signature ingredient, the dish on the Veranda menu that had been mentioned by name in the Sunset profile. Theodora considered the offer. She walked the forest. She talked to Wendell, who was now 81, and who walked with a cane, but who still came down on Sundays to drink coffee and watch the forest from the porch. Wendell told her, on a quiet Sunday in late March of 1986, that it was her decision to make, and that he would support whatever she chose, but that he had watched her negotiate with Tomás Vargas in 1983, and that she had read that man correctly the first time, and that if Tomás was offering an exclusive contract at $5 a pound, it meant Tomás was about to be approached by Theodora's competitors and was trying to prevent it. He was right. 2 new restaurants had opened in Portland that winter that were trying to source forest-cultivated shiitake. One had reached out to Higgins Fresh. The other had called Theodora directly. Theodora called Tomás back the next day. She accepted the exclusive contract for autumn 1987 at $5 a pound, with a clause that would adjust the price upward if any competitor offered her higher than $5. The agreement was signed in April of 1986. The autumn of 1987 was the autumn of the title that prompts this story. The forest was, by October of 1987, more productive than it had ever been. The original 200 logs from 1976 were 11 years old, at the upper end of their commercial productivity, but still fruiting. The 1979, 1980, 1981, and 1982 batches were all in peak production. The newer batches from 1985 and 1986 were just beginning to fruit. Theodora's total production for the autumn of 1987 was 14,600 pounds of fresh shiitake. At $5 a pound, the gross income was $73,000. Of this, the largest single delivery was made on October 22, 1987, when Theodora and Elena and Silas, who was 19 and home from his first year at Oregon State University, drove to Portland in the F-100 with 2,800 pounds of mushrooms in flat wooden crates packed with damp moss. Tomás had a private event that weekend. He was cooking a dinner for 40 guests at the home of a wine importer in the West Hills. The dinner had been profiled in Bon Appetit 2 months in advance. The signature course, at the center of the menu, was a shiitake preparation that Tomás had developed in 1984 and had been refining ever since, served on a single warm plate, alongside a Pinot Noir that the wine importer had grown himself. Tomás paid Theodora for the entire 2,800-pound delivery in a single check at the Veranda restaurant kitchen on the morning of the delivery. He wrote the check in green ink at the prep station while she watched. The amount was $14,000. He handed her the check. He had something he had been preparing to say. "Teddy, Tomás, I want to tell you something I have been thinking about for 2 years. Tell me. I started cooking when I was 16. I have eaten in 140 restaurants on 3 continents. I have worked with mushrooms from France and from Japan and from Vermont. The mushrooms you grow in your forest are the best I have ever cooked with. I want you to know that I know that, and that I have known it since the first time I walked into your woods in 1983. Theodora folded the check. She put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at Tomás. She had known him for 4 years. She had watched him build his restaurant from a 32-seat side street operation into a place that food writers in San Francisco called the most important restaurant in the Pacific Northwest. She had watched him stay loyal to her through 3 years of growth when other restaurants had begun to outbid him. She had seen him become, in the autumn of 1986, when Wendell had finally died at age 82, one of the 7 people she counted as something close to family. Tomás. Yes, Teddy. 11 years ago, I sat in a hospital parking lot trying to figure out how to pay for my son's leukemia treatment with no income and no plan. I sat in that parking lot for 37 minutes. I started this operation because I had no other ideas. I started it for the money. I want you to know that. The money was the reason. Tomás was quiet. He had not expected this. But somewhere in the second year, the money stopped being the reason. The forest started being the reason. The logs started being the reason. The mushrooms growing on those logs in the autumn dark when nobody could see them. The way the bark felt under my hands when I was inoculating in June. The smell of the wax melting in the shed. The sound of the wind on the north slope at 4 in the morning when I was checking for pin mushrooms. By the end of the third year, I would have kept doing it if there had been no money in it. By the end of the 5th year, I would have kept doing it if it had cost me money. The reason changed. I do not have a way to explain that to anyone. I have not tried to explain it to Silas, because he is 19, and he does not need to know yet. But you walked into my forest in 1983, and you understood it without me having to say it. And I think you understand what I am telling you now. Tomás nodded. He had stopped trying to say anything for a long moment. They stood in the prep kitchen of the Veranda restaurant on a Thursday morning in October of 1987 with a $14,000 check in Theodora Holcomb's pocket and 2,800 pounds of fresh shiitake mushrooms on the steel prep tables behind them. And the conversation that needed to happen between them had finished without either of them needing to finish it out loud. Theodora drove home with Eleanor and Silas. Silas drove the second half. They did not talk about the money on the drive. Theodora ran the operation for 16 more autumns. She added 3,000 more logs in the late 1980s. She brought Silas into the operation as a partner in 1991 after he finished his degree in forestry at Oregon State. She survived the recession of the early 1990s by holding her prices and refusing to discount even when Tomás's restaurant nearly closed in 1993 because Portland's restaurant scene had gotten ahead of itself. Tomás recovered. He opened a second restaurant in 1996. He stayed her primary buyer until he sold both restaurants in 2003 and moved to Mexico to write a cookbook. By then, Theodora was supplying 9 restaurants across Oregon and Washington. The operation, by 2003, was producing 22,000 pounds of shiitake per year and grossing close to $200,000 against operating costs of about $40,000. Silas managed the day-to-day. Theodora was 59 and walked the forest with a slower step, but with the same notebook she had carried since 1978. The hospital bills had been paid off for 20 years. The cabin had been expanded twice. The F-100 was retired in 1998 and replaced with a 1996 Chevrolet that Silas had bought used. The back 180 had never been logged. Wendell's original investment of $14 an acre in 1952 had grown, on paper, to a property valued in 2003 at approximately $4,200 per acre as forest, and the value of the producing logs and the established operation, as a going concern, added another estimated $600,000 to the total. The Holcomb operation in 2003 was worth, as a complete asset, somewhere between $1.4 and $1.7 million on a piece of land that Eldridge Marsh had recommended in 1977 that she sell to Weyerhaeuser for $14,400. Silas had a daughter in 1998. Her name was Hazel. Hazel Holcomb in 2014 was 16 years old, finishing her sophomore year of high school, and had been walking the forest with her grandmother every Sunday morning since she was 6. Theodora was 70 by the autumn of 2014. She walked with a cane. She slept later than she used to. She still worked the forest, but she had stopped doing the heavy work, which Silas and Hazel and Elena's daughter Mariana now handled. The October morning that ends this story is a Sunday morning in mid-October of 2014. The forest is wet from a 3-day rain. Theodora and Hazel walk together along the row of the very oldest logs, which are now 38 years old, almost entirely decayed back into the soil, but still producing the occasional final mushroom every other autumn. Hazel is wearing a yellow rain jacket that used to belong to her father. Theodora is wearing the same olive canvas jacket she has worn in the forest since 1978, with a darker stain on the left elbow from a wax heater accident in 1981. They walk slowly. Hazel stops at the 17th log of the third row, the same log where the first pin mushroom appeared in October of 1978, although Hazel does not yet know this. Hazel says, "Grandma." "Yes, Hazel. Why did you do this? The mushrooms? Why did you start?" Theodora is quiet for a moment. She has known this question would come. She has been waiting for it for 10 years. "I started for the money, Hazel. I started for your father's medical bills. The money was the reason." Hazel nods. Hazel has heard pieces of the story before. But the money stopped being the reason in 1979. By 1979, the reason was the forest. "The forest," Hazel says. "Yes, the forest." Hazel does not understand yet. Theodora does not expect her to. Theodora kneels down by the 17th log, slowly with effort, and she puts her hand on the bark, and she invites Hazel to put her hand next to hers. The bark is soft and damp and full of the slow life of decomposition. The log is no longer producing in any commercial sense. It is returning to the soil. But there are still threads of mycelium running through it, woven through the wood like a hidden network, white and fine, and where the bark has fallen away in places they are visible to the eye if you know to look. "Hazel, look." Hazel looks. Theodora pulls back a small piece of loose bark with her thumb. The white network is there beneath it, dense and intricate. That is the mycelium. That has been there for 36 years. It is older than your father. It is older than you. It will be here when I am gone. It is not mine. It was never mine. That is what I learned in the second year. The forest does not belong to me. The forest does not belong to anyone. The forest does not even belong to itself. The forest is what happens when you stop trying to own it. Hazel kneels next to her grandmother. She does not say anything. The rain is starting again, light on the canopy above them. Theodora's hand is still on the bark. "Hazel, when I am gone, you will own this land in trust. Your father has already arranged it. You will have decisions to make. There will be people who will offer you money to clear the timber. There will be people who will offer you money to develop. There will be people who will tell you that the back 180 is too valuable to leave as forest." Hazel: "Yes, Grandma, listen to me. The forest will tell you what to do, if you are quiet enough to hear it." That is what I learned. That is the only thing I learned that matters. The mushrooms were not the lesson. The money was not the lesson. The lesson is that the forest knew what it was doing for 10,000 years before I got here, and it will know what it is doing for 10,000 years after I am gone. My job, when I figured it out in the second year, was not to plant the mushrooms. My job was to listen to where the mushrooms wanted to grow. My job was to be quiet. My job was to stop trying to control it. And the moment I stopped trying to control it, the forest gave me everything I needed. Everything. The medical bills, the cabin, the truck, the years with your father, the years with you. All of it came because I stopped fighting the forest and started listening to it. Hazel is crying quietly. Theodora is not crying. She has finished crying for one lifetime. Theodora, Hazel. "Yes, Grandma, the world will laugh at you for things. They laughed at me. They laughed for almost 6 years. The laughter was loud, and it came from people I had known my whole life. I want you to know that the laughter does not matter. The laughter never mattered. The laughter is what people do when they cannot hear what you are listening to. They are not bad people. They are simply not listening. You will meet many people in your life who are not listening. Most people are not listening. The few who are listening are the ones you build a life with. I built a life with 5 people, Hazel. Your grandfather Charles, your great-grandfather Wendell, Tomás Vargas, Elena Mendez, and your father. 5 people in 70 years. That is enough. You will know when you have met them. You will know because they will hear what you are saying, and they will not laugh, and they will walk into your forest, and they will see what you have been growing. Theodora stands up slowly, with her hand on Hazel's shoulder. They walk back to the cabin together through the wet rose. The rain is light. The forest is silent, except for the sound of water moving through leaves and the distant call of a thrush. Hazel does not say anything. Theodora does not say anything. There is nothing more that needs to be said. The lesson has been passed. Theodora Holcomb died in February of 2018 in her bed in the cabin at age 73. Silas runs the operation. Hazel finished a degree in forest ecology at Oregon State in 2020 and came home in 2021 to take over the daily management. The forest still produces shiitake. The mycelium that Theodora inoculated in 1976 is no longer producing on those original logs, but the spawn she made from those logs in subsequent years has been propagating for decades through the forest, and Hazel has begun to believe, based on observations she has been making for the past 2 summers, that some of the wild mycelium now established under the canopy is naturally fruiting in places where Theodora never inoculated, which would mean that the forest itself has become a self-sustaining shiitake ecosystem, the first of its kind documented in North America. Hazel does not know yet whether her observation is correct. She is taking samples. She is reading the mycology literature. She is doing the work her grandmother taught her to do, which is to be quiet and to listen and to be patient and to take notes. She is not in a hurry. She walks the forest every morning. The lesson her grandmother left her was not about mushrooms, and not about money, and not about the laughter at the Cross Hill feed and grain in February of 1977, although all of those things are part of the story. The lesson was that some things in this life cannot be controlled, and the wisest thing a person can do is to stop trying and to begin listening, and to allow the forest or the field or the life to give what it is going to give. The mushroom does not grow because you commanded it. The mushroom grows because you prepared the log, and you chose the right shade, and you waited, and you stopped pretending you were the one in charge. Theodora Holcomb learned this in the autumn of 1977, when she had been alone in the forest for 16 months, and the laughter at the feed store had become unbearable, and she had no choice but to either keep going or sell to Weyerhaeuser, and she chose to keep going. And somewhere on a wet morning in November of that year, she stopped fighting the forest and started listening to it. And the forest answered. The forest is still answering. It will answer Hazel in time. It will answer anyone who is willing to be quiet and to listen. That is the lesson. That is the only lesson.